So hi everyone and welcome to Protecht's next Thought Leadership webinar where we're looking at risk appetite for dummies, and always conscious of using that title, but be very clear that that is based on our book that we recently produced on risk appetite under the Wiley's Dummies brand. The concept really here is simplicity, and we really want to take you through the principles of risk appetite in a really simple, practical way. Now, in terms of what we're going to cover, as I'm going to talk as the author of the book to a degree, but I've also been ably assisted in producing that book by my trusty steed, Michael. And Michael, I'll get you to introduce yourself. I'll do a quick intro and then we'll get into the webinar. Michael.
Thanks, David. Yes, glad to have worked with you on this one. So my name is Michael. I'm the Senior Manager of Research and Content at Protecht. Title somewhat says it all, but I'm a risk nerd by nature. I love looking into what is happening in the world of risk and risk management, and feed a lot of that work closely with our product team on our GRC SaaS solution, as well as building up the knowledge of our teams and our customers throughout their risk management journey.
Thank you, Michael. And for myself, as I mentioned, did put this Risk Appetite for Dummies book together, but also I'm the Chief Research and Content Officer, as Michael said, fairly self-explanatory, but also a co-founder of Protecht. So who is Protecht? We're 26 years old this year, and we are focused on providing our clients with a whole range of services around risk management. Having said that, our focus is our Protecht ERM system, which is a full-blown GRC platform, which provides you all of your elements of risk management across risk assessments, key risk indicators, incident management, resilience, vendor risk management, compliance, and so on. Now, in terms of, I guess, what we think makes us different, which is very important for us, is we are not a technology firm that built risk software. We are risk managers who built a GRC system. And what that really means is that with our work we do with clients, and even with you guys sharing information on webinars, is we really focus heavily on the practice of risk management, obviously facilitated by and powered by our Protecht ERM system. Now, in terms of the objectives today, I'm focusing on what we covered in the book, but giving it a bit of colour and life. First of all, creating an effective risk appetite statement, that RAS at board level. How do we produce one that is meaningful and engaging with the board of directors and management? Number two, defining risk appetite to support your objectives. Very importantly, remembering risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So what we're really doing is setting an appetite for the degree of uncertainty we wish to have around our objectives. And really, the key to it all, though, is embedding it within the business, making it usable. Any document that sits on the board table that collects dust and isn't used is a waste of time. So the key to getting value out of risk appetite is making sure it is embedded in the business and it guides the business in decision making. Now, in terms of the housekeeping, we typically do the same in every webinar. So you might be familiar if you've been here before, around 60 minutes. And as we go through, if you can please ask questions as we go, we will then be doing a post-webinar feedback around those questions, a blog, so that everybody's got a written response. In addition, at the end of the webinar, we would love you to spend a couple of minutes filling in the post-webinar questionnaire. And as always, people always ask, are the slides and recording available? Yes, they will be made available to you to get when we send out the blog as well afterwards, answering your questions. So let's get stuck into it. I do love this quote in Risk Appetite. I never trust people with no appetite. It's like they're always holding something back on you. And it's a really good preface for what we're going to cover, because we sometimes find boards, executive management teams, when asked what their risk appetite is, they say very low, 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 zero, zero, low, very low. Now, all of us would appreciate that they're definitely holding something back on you, and that is their willingness to take risk. And if they hold back on appetite, they're not going to enjoy that dinner. They're not going to enjoy that breakfast, because with appetite comes opportunity. We've got to get the balance right. So I really love this statement to really set the scene for what we're going to cover. So what exactly are we going to cover? Firstly, understanding what risk appetite is, and then moving to setting the right risk appetite for your business, which is really key at executive and board level. Creating your risk appetite statement. So what does that risk appetite statement look like at the board level, because they own that statement? And how do we go then taking that and embedding it in the business, particularly so it can be used for good risk reward decision making? Then we're going to show you some tips for effective risk management, particularly around risk appetite. What are the tips for effective risk appetite? And then lastly, putting it all together with a little bit of practical illustration using our Protecht EOM system. So firstly, understanding risk appetite. Going back to the ISO 31000 standard, it tells us that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So if we then move on to what does that effect really mean? Now, the effect on the objectives is a deviation from the expected outcome for your targeted objectives. The standard says it could be both positive, sometimes expressed as opportunities, and negative, sometimes expressed as threats, or both. Some of us sometimes forget about the opportunity side. What does this definition mean? It means that risk can have two sides. The first side is the threat side. We're all very familiar with that. It's where the outcome is not as good as what we expect. We sometimes call that loss, danger, harm, injury, and so on. However, some risks and some risks only have an upside, which is the opportunity side. And that is where the outcome can be better than expected. This concept of two sides gives rise to two types of risk. The first type of risk we face is a one-sided threat risk only. This is a risk that only has the downside. Workhouse safety, injury to our people. I don't see any really direct upside here. It's threat risk only. The other side of the other type of risk, has both threat and opportunity. There's less of these. Now, all risk has a threat side, but only some has an opportunity side. Let's take the example of loss of key staff. We obviously know the threat side of losing a key staff member, losing that knowledge, cost of recruiting a new person, time it takes to get the new person up to speed, and maybe the new person isn't as good as the last one. What's the upside, however? This is where we now get someone better than the person who left. We don't know what we don't know. Now, this is very important, these two types of risk, because the appetite we set will be different based on these two types of risk. Put very simply, which we'll cover later, for a threat risk only, we should be looking to reduce that risk to as low as reasonably practicable. For a threat and opportunity risk, though, we don't want to necessarily do that, because if we minimize the risk or reduce it to as low as reasonably practicable, we're getting rid of the potential for opportunity. And therefore, we might willingly have an appetite to pursue opportunity. So with that said then, let's have a look at what risk appetite is. Now, taking the definition of risk that we spoke about earlier, it's the degree of uncertainty on objectives the organisation is prepared to accept in pursuit of those objectives. Asking a board member or a CEO, how much variation are you willing to expect around your return on capital or return on assets or whatever other objective they may have? That is truly what risk appetite is. The problem is it's very reactive, because the outcome of what we do is the end of the journey. Now, substituting now the definition of risk from ISO 31000, we can then simply say, which most people do, the degree of risk, remember uncertainty on objectives, that the organisation is prepared to accept in pursuit of its strategic objectives and business plans. You will see a strong scattering of the word objectives and business plans and strategy. That's because we cannot be managing risk or developing risk appetite without due attention to the other side of risk, which is reward, which is objectives, which is outcomes. Now, sometimes at Protecht, we take a really simple view with risk appetite, and we call it freedom within boundaries. And what this does, it gives our people freedom at the different levels of the organisation to take risks, because risk taking is critically important in every organisation. Number two, making decisions. Number three, doing things, because everything we do has risk involved. And very importantly, freedom to fail. Some people don't like that, but it's very important. If we set an appetite above zero, which you're going to have to in order to be successful, if someone is operating within that appetite and they fail, and they do not fail deliberately or negligently, our response should be, there. It's okay. We expected you to fail now and again. What did we learn from that experience? We should not in any way reprimand them because we've given them the freedom to actually fail. And all of this comes together in terms of a framework, in terms of linking risk appetite to objectives to risk management through what Protecht calls its pyramid, its risk reward pyramid. Let's take a look at it at the highest level to see how this all connects. Now, starting with risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The starting point for all risk management, and dare I say all management, is what is our vision, mission, and from there cascading that down into actionable objectives. And we generally break it down into operational objectives. These are run the organization's objectives. We'll take a look at those in more detail later. And strategic objectives, which is to change the organization. That top of the pyramid is the holy grail. That's what we're aiming for in business, and that's what we're aiming for in risk management. The two are aligned. Now, objectives are an end. What's the means to the end? What are the critical things we need to do really, really well to meet those objectives? Operational objectives need a strong operating model, our critical processes, critical operations. And our strategic objectives need our strategic projects to be delivered on time, quality, and within budget. And when those projects of change get delivered, they deliver a permanent change to the operating model. And that layer there are our critical processes and projects. They are what makes the objectives happen. Now, the third layer, we add in then the things that could mess that up, typically called risks, operational and financial risks, strategic and project risks. And that layer there are our risks, our risk classifications, risk taxonomy that Michael will touch upon later. The last thing then to do is to manage that risk, operational, financial risk management, strategic and project risk management, and then change delivered risk management or risk in change. And that is our enterprise risk management piece, or GRC, whatever acronym you wish to use. So in that, we've now got a strong connection between our risk management, our risks, and our outcomes. Now, if we focus on risk appetite, what is risk appetite? Risk appetite is the maximum amount that level 3 can be. What is the extremities of what it can be? I want you to do a quick visualization. I want you to now imagine that we go to a board and we ask them their risk appetite and they go 0, 0, very low, and 0. They are now squashing that middle layer to a very, very thin layer. What does that do to the top of the pyramid? It drops it. So if you've got very, very low risk appetite, it's likely your reward will be insufficient for you to be sustainable. And within 1, 3, 5 years, you are no more, i.e. you demise slowly. Equally, what if the board says our appetite is very high, very high and extreme? You're now raising that third layer to very, very wide. What does it do to the top? Shoots it up. Boom, boom, boom. A gust of wind comes along, though, the structure is not stable and it collapses in a heap on the ground, bust. So too high a risk appetite, boom, boom, bust, you demise quickly. Too low appetite, you don't have any boom and you bust slowly, you demise slowly. Both are the same result, they are both a problem. The key is getting a balance to get the right risk appetite for the right level of reward, the objectives you are aiming for. It's very clear, therefore, you need to develop risk appetite in conjunction with your strategic planning. So to summarize the implications then, right, there are two types of risk. Risk appetite for one-sided threat risk should be aiming at ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable, sometimes called so far as reasonably practicable. For our two-sided threat risks, threat and opportunity risk, we may not wish to reduce it to as low as reasonably practical because of the pursuit of opportunity and reward. Therefore, it will be focusing balance on risk levels and reward. Now, remember, too low risk appetite, we demise slowly. Too high risk appetite, we demise quickly. Both are unacceptable. The greater the risk appetite, the greater the average success, but the greater the variation in the success, therefore possibility of major failure if you go too high risk. The classic risk reward equation, which we'll visualize in a second. The lower the appetite, the greater the investment in controls and risk management, and that comes with a cost. So you can't over control your risks in your organization to the point where it is no longer viable. If we now move that logic and that framework to ISO 31000, our risk management standard, where does risk appetite sit? Now, you appreciate we've got 8 steps in ISO 31000. What are they? Step number 1, communication and consultation. We ask our external and internal employee stakeholders, what do they expect from us? And that includes expectation of the amount of risk that they are willing for us as an organisation to take, particularly risks that affect them. And they tell us what they are. We listen, and we now go in-house, which is called scope, context and criteria. And we listen to the stakeholders and we develop an overarching risk appetite, which measures and balances the needs of the stakeholders by risk type. That is our RAS. Now, that is criteria. Scope and context is what are our strategy and objectives and what are our critical processes and projects. It is interesting to note that we're 2 steps through 8 steps of the standard, and it hasn't yet mentioned the word risk, but it has mentioned the word appetite and objectives. Just saying. We now move to risk identification. What are the risks that could mess up the critical processes and therefore impact on our objectives? I shouldn't say just mess up, because we've got to remember opportunity risks that could enhance and therefore get better opportunity. Once we've identified the risks, we then analyse those risks, understand them. We at Protecht love bow tie analysis, and also measure them. What's their size, whatever method you wish to use. Stage 5 now, we take that measurement and we evaluate it against risk appetite. Are we above risk appetite? Are we below? If we're above, we need to do something about it. Risk treatment, including controls. And there, from there, we then need to build this into day-to-day monitoring and review. And finally, we need to record all of that so that we can provide it to people that need to make risk-reward decision-making and also provide assurance, red flags, and so on. Now, as you can see here, ISO 31000 has risk appetite in sections 1 and 2 explicitly, and it is then used in step 5 as well. So it's integral to the whole framework, the whole risk management framework and processes you have. Do not let your risk appetite statement be developed by the board and then sit and collect dust and not be operationalised, because you're not achieving anything of ISO 31000 in doing that. So I want to bring that together with a simple diagram where we've got the 2 partners in our risk-reward relationship, reward vertical axis, risk horizontal. Let's have a look at the relationship and how the 2 relate. First of all, let's have a look at the average expected reward relating risk to reward. The higher the risk, the average expected reward is to go up. Yeah, the lower the risk, the lower the reward. Now, that diagram would imply that we should always have a massive risk appetite because we're always going to get a high reward, but we're missing something, because the higher the risk, the greater the variation around that expected reward. Now, the particularly harmful one is the one at the bottom of the red line, and you can see there's a point where we are starting to make big losses from this. Now, that is the variation, and that is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, the level of uncertainty. So what is risk appetite? Risk appetite is that. The first way we can look at it is to say we will not accept a level of variation at that red line more than the gap between the green and the red line. Equally, we can measure it off as a level of risk there. So we can measure appetite based on variation on objectives as well as the level of risk. Now, this then tells us the higher the risk, the higher the average reward, but the higher the risk, the greater the variation in reward.
So throughout the book, David, we've got a lot of these little tips. Anyone who knows the Dummies brand will have seen these. But I think really what you're getting at there is that it's that balance between pursuit of objectives or pursuit of reward and balancing your risks and risk appetite and the amount of risks you're willing to take. I think it really highlights that those 2 things really need to be considered together. If your board or executive are thinking about their strategic planning on one day, and then the next day now they're thinking about risk appetite completely independently, they're probably missing a beat there in bringing those 2 things together.
As I always say, Michael, the happy marriage between the partners of risk and reward. Thank you. So let's move on to setting the right risk appetite for your business. With everything we do at Protecht, we always ask the why question. So I'm going to ask it of risk appetite. Why? What is the value of risk appetite? Number 1, setting those risk boundaries to allow staff to make decisions, but for decisions to make sure that the level of risk in those decisions are within our boundaries, to set the outer bit that they can go to give them boundaries within which to operate. Forms the basis of escalating risk reporting and response. We typically see the red, amber, green concept going on. We'll show you that later. So it's a great way of getting the right information to the right people and requesting the right level of response. As we cascade the risk appetite through the business, it then allows us to form the delegations of authority to empower people at different levels. Appetite boundaries get less and lower as we go through the organisation. It also represents our risk culture. Therefore, it should be used to communicate to all staff as one key element of our risk culture. And lastly, very importantly, it provides an important step in risk reward decision making, the can I test, which I'll explain in a few minutes.
You mentioned before, David, you don't want your risk appetite statement to be sitting at the board level and then collecting dust. So one of our key tips is just make sure that it is then cascaded down. It is starting to support decision making across the organisation. Even if your frontline staff don't know that it is from a risk appetite statement, it still needs to be cascaded down the organisation. And David will cover that a little bit later in this session.
Exactly right. I mean, I always say, so what with risk management? And if you've got a risk appetite statement collecting dust, there is no so what. And the big so what is risk reward decision making. So let's look at the overarching risk appetite methodology that Protecht subscribes to, and we've developed over probably about 15 years now, trial and error, and this is where we are in 2025. Number one, we need to set our appetite levels and tolerance evaluation zones. We're going to show you this practically in a second. So what are your levels of appetite that you're going to say? And we define appetite as a qualitative representation of the boundary, and tolerance, which is a metric evaluation of the boundary, and that measures about where we are. The next one is then objectives, identifying your strategic operational objectives and related measures of success, KPIs and KPI targets. Articulate qualitative appetite against each objective and against each of your KPI targets, and then set your KPI thresholds, green to amber, amber to red, right? Being cognizant of the qualitative appetite level. We will illustrate this later. Risks, determine risks for which appetite will be set, the risk taxonomy. Determine the risk appetite for each key risk. This is qualitative. Identify how you're going to track those with metrics, KRIs, and then set your green, amber, amber, red thresholds for each appetite level. Operationalize, and then go celebrate. Celebration takes a while because operationalization is not easy. Let's take a look at these then. First of all, setting our appetite levels. Now, we use a very simple one typically with clients. 0, low, medium and high. Some like to have 0/very low if they're not comfortable with totally 0. And this one illustrates what we would generally define the meaning of each of those for objectives, setting the appetite on objectives or level of uncertainty on objectives. I'm not going to read them, you can take them away. On the right side now, it's very similar, but this time we're referring to risks, the risks. So we set appetite for objectives and we set appetite for risks. The two are obviously connected because risks impact on objectives. We then move to, once we've identified our metrics, we then need to scale them so we can report green, yellow, red. And in terms of this, what you're going to do is how many zones are you going to have? Typically we see 3. What do the zones mean? Typically, green means within appetite, no action required. Yellow means within appetite, raised attention. And red means outside of appetite, immediate action required. You would need to add your own words in there that's relevant for you, but they're the principles. So that's the first step, setting those. That allows us to then understand our zones and also our terminology. So risk capacity, maximum amount of risk we can take before it threatens our survival, top of the red zone. Risk appetite is a qualitative representation of the amber to red cutoff or threshold. Maximum amount of risk we take before it goes outside of appetite. Risk tolerance is the same point, but now using a measurable metric. And we have then an upper tolerance, which is amber to red, and a lower tolerance, which is green to amber. And that differentiates where we take no action and where we raise attention. Now, with this, speaking of objectives, many clients I go into and do risk management, and they appoint us for risk management work. I start talking about objectives, and then they say to me, well, what are those? And they start telling me objectives, the strategic plan, operational objectives, and many of them are very, very unclear. They're not really measurable objectives. They're more kind of visions, like to haves, and their operational objectives are not clear. So I want to spend a minute or two just talking through these. Strategic objectives. They are to change the organization. You expect those objectives to be supported by one or more current or planned strategic projects. If you have a strategic objective that is not supported by one or more strategic project, it's very unlikely to be strategic. It is more likely to be a long-term operational objective. It's pretty obvious where these come from, straight from the strategic plan, usually under themes such as digital strategy, HR strategy, product strategy, and so on. Now we move to operational objectives. These are all about running the business as usual. Best way to think about these is assume your operating model stays the same. What is the reason you get up every day? What is the objective of your organization? Now, I've shared with you 9 pretty standard objectives for most organizations. If you haven't done this before, you can use this as a guideline. You will obviously have to tailor it. You may have to add an additional one. You may have to remove some. But basically, these are the typical 9 objectives for pretty much every organization. I'm not going to go through those with you, but I'll leave those with you. Obviously, one of the things we've got to do in a GRC system is remember it should be a GRCO system. Governance, risk, compliance, and objectives. But no, we're not going to add that to the objective, but the acronym, don't worry. But it does need to be included. Michael.
I think you make a really good point there, David. Just want to highlight is that once you start thinking about documenting, or you commit to documenting and bringing these two things together, objectives and risk, or risk and reward, is it does make you really think about what you're going to be putting into a platform like Protecht ERM or GRC platforms, to make sure you really are articulating those objectives very well and that everyone agrees on them. So I think it's a really great way to just bring people around the table and make sure that you're capturing this data. And so here is a quick example of customer satisfaction being one of those key themes. And we'll build upon this as we sort of walk through the rest of the dummies discussion today. So good enterprise intelligence software, GRCO software, if you like, can obviously automate some of that data collection. You want to bring together the risk and reward. So being able to automate that data collection point then allows you to both evaluate against the zones that we're going to cover, and also bring together a lot of the reporting processes. Again, we'll bring that to life towards the end of today's session. So David mentioned those operational objectives, and this is an example of those on the left. And on the right-hand side here, we've got a typical risk taxonomy covering the 3 main types: strategic, financial, and operational. Now you need to start thinking about risk and reward balance, understanding what are the objectives that you have, and then what are the key risks that would influence or impact on the ability to meet those objectives. Now, for many of them, there will be a many-to-many relationship, and the challenge is which ones do you link to make sure you're delivering the right level of reporting and insights to your stakeholders. So what we typically recommend is pick those key risks, whether it might be 3 to 5, that really impact that particular objective the most, to really highlight the key ones that you're going to need to care about, or the objective owner is going to need to care about. So this is an example of how that would look in practice, taking our objective that we've already identified and linking some of those particular risks that we know will influence customer satisfaction in this particular example. So we've taken the objective, we're taking the risk, but now we need to think about how we articulate some of those and look at those evaluation zones.
Thank you, Michael. So now what we're going to do is move to creating your risk appetite statement. And I want to just take you through an example of everything we've covered in a subset of what you would typically see in an organization. Why? So I can fit it on a PowerPoint slide. So the starting point is, what are your objectives? We've just covered those. Number 2, what are your risks? Michael's just covered those, and I'm just taking a subset. What we then need to do is come up with what are our appetite levels. As we just spoke about, 0, low, medium, and high, or whatever you wish to use. What you then need to do is with the executive team and the board's involvement, but remembering the board actually own this, they're the end owner and the signer off of the risk appetite statement. They need to articulate what level of uncertainty are they willing to accept around each of those objectives. Now, this is obviously a conversation starter, a debate to be had, because we're doing it qualitatively. But I find it very useful at board level to have this conversation, because what they do is start comparing the level of uncertainty they're willing to accept around their different objectives to get some kind of balance. Here we've got customer satisfaction, medium; profitability, medium; compliance, zero; appetite. Now, on the right side, remember, and this is the impact from our risk. This is the reactive side of risk. We need to get ahead of ourselves. This bit's lagging. We need to get ahead of ourselves. What's ahead of ourselves? All the things that could cause these objectives to be negatively impacted and or positively impacted. Now, these are our risks. So I'm now taking those risks and I'm getting an appetite to be set. Again, the board will articulate a qualitative appetite. Here, they've gone strategic risk. We want a high appetite. Why? Because that is a two-sided risk, because there is a very large opportunity side for taking higher strategic risk, but obviously the threat side is bigger. Now, this organization would obviously want to be a leader in their industry, because they want innovation. And obviously that then highlights over on the left, the profitability. They're willing to accept a medium amount, because if they wanted low amount, they couldn't be a leader. Equally, customer satisfaction, well, they might do some strategic things that don't really work out and upset the customer. And as a result of that, you've got to make sure the left and the right are married, but they don't need to be equal, but they should at least talk to one another. And that is appetite qualitative. What we now need to do is look at metrics that we can use to track each of these. Now, if we're going to use metrics, we need to set our tolerance scales. We've already covered those. And now for our objectives, we identify our measures of success, which we typically call KPIs. And we've given some examples of KPIs there. Now, based on the appetite qualitative, we then set the green to amber and amber to red zones. And this then will be used for our reporting. Now, this is KPI reporting. A lot of you might be doing this out of your strategy department or performance department, and you may get some resistance for risk management wanting to get involved. Break down those silos, because you should be reporting together. Now let's look at the risks in a similar manner. This time what we're doing is coming up with a key risk indicator, an indicator of risk. Some people say, what's the difference between a KRI and a KPI? My answer is not a lot. A KPI measures directly the degree to which you're achieving your stated objectives, period, that's it. KRIs measure proxies of measurement of the risks that could impact on those objectives. And what's critically important here is that your objectives, right, are SMART objectives. And the key word there is measurable. They need to be measurable. So many times I ask a person or a company what's their objectives. They tell me, I go, how are you going to measure that? And they go, we don't know. I'm not sure that's a good objective if you can't measure it. So based on that, we then need to consider how we then start recording that. Michael.
So expanding on our previous example of customer satisfaction and an objective to improve retention, here we're measuring customer retention rate, which is exactly related to that particular objective, as well as net promoter score, which is very closely linked, number of churn customers. So here we've chosen some very specific metrics that meet that SMART goal, making sure that we can measure them. They're linked directly to that objective and are an outcome of the objective itself. So moving then to risk appetite, this is the qualitative assessment of that. As David said, it's a bit of a shirt sizing exercise where you can compare some of your objectives against each other and provide that rationale for why that level of risk or variation around that objective is acceptable. So this is an example of then setting some of those thresholds specifically. So we've got the measurement itself, but then we need to figure out what are the targets, what are the thresholds, and in this example for churn, anything below 5% might be fine. But once we get to 15%, we know that we are not meeting the objective that we've set. So on those objectives and thresholds in particular is being inclusive and talking to your people about, as you're setting your risk appetite, setting those thresholds. Some of those people on the front line know those processes that will provide that level of, or those numbers or outputs. So getting them involved helps embed risk appetite in the front line and know that they've been involved in setting some of those thresholds and setting the appetite for the organization, and then allows them to be more embedded and help further support the decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis.
It just reminded when you were speaking, Michael, is a typical thing that happens is that we say the board of directors owns the risk appetite, which they do, and they need to sign it off and they need to have final approval. But if you go to a board and go, what's your risk appetite? They look at each other, a lot of them, no disrespect, and they go, what does the executive think? Oh, okay. So we generally start with the exec. We come up with a draft risk appetite statement, and we then go to the board and we have two columns, one that shows blanks, what the board thinks, and the other one, when we uncover it, shows what the exec thinks. And then when the board says, what does the exec think, we uncover it and go, well, that's what they think. And then it opens up the conversation for challenging. You can imagine the exec, they work down lower and lower and lower, exactly what you were saying. Not only does that get you a better risk appetite statement, but as you quite rightly say, it gets ownership across the organization. So great point. Now, the risk appetite statement itself, yes, typically a document, up to you how long, but this is a typical document contents, and I'm not going to read that through because you would need a magnifying glass, but please do that in your own time. But it's just to really highlight what that document looks like. Now, the document on its own is worthless. It's operationalizing that matters. The most important part of that document is what we just covered as an example. Here's an example where we are summarizing, and this is particularly the risk side of the equation. What's the risk? What's the measurables? What's the appetite we've got on that? And from there, set in the green to yellow and yellow to red thresholds, which we can then use for reporting.
I think maybe I got ahead of myself a little bit, David. We covered this, I guess, in that last slide as well, is just making sure you've got that clear communication with those frontline people, because then it embeds it in their daily role. So it might not be, as I said earlier, not necessarily the exact risk appetite statement, but how it cascades down to them specifically in their role. So they might not need to see the board level of risk appetite, but how it cascades, whether it's through metrics or other factors, how it cascades down into their role to get it embedded in that front line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the key to this is if you think about asking your staff, when I'm wandering around client staff, I will often ask them, how many of you have seen the risk appetite statement? That's a telling question. Or how many hands go up? And then for those hands do go up, do you understand it? I would just put to all of you on this webinar, go try it and see what happens. If the answer is no, what is a risk appetite statement? That's not a good start. And if they say, well, yes, we've read it, but it seems like a bit of a kind of woolly board document, it's obviously not useful. So really two key points for you to go and take away to see where you stand. And that's a wonderful segue then into what we're going to cover now, which is embedding and using risk appetite for decision making. So I'm going to jump to the chase of decision making. First of all, one of the most important uses of risk appetite, and then we'll have a look at the more general ways of embedding it across the organization and operationalizing it. Now, we take a fairly simple view of risk reward decision making. Again, that simple view, I'm not going to say dummy view, but simple view. And that is whenever you make a decision, subconsciously or consciously, you should use the can I, should I method. Very simple. Can I is when you look at a decision and you look at the level of risk in that decision and you assess whether or not it's within your risk appetite. If it's not within your risk appetite, you can't do it. If it is within your risk appetite, you can, but maybe you shouldn't. And obviously, if you come across a risk that is outside of appetite, prima facie, you can't do it. But you might think the opportunity is so amazing that you really think it's worthwhile. What do you need to do? You need to take it to the board of directors and see if they're willing to increase the risk appetite to capture that reward. If they say no, you can't do it. There is no option. If they say yes, great, we've got to increase risk appetite, and now you've moved to can. Once you've then got your cans, you then go to should I. And for the cans, and you've said yes to, you then should say, is the reward worth it for the level of risk? If you get 2 yeses, you should do it. If you get 1 or 2 no's, you should not do it. Now, the next example is one I want you to do in your heads, right? And this is going to be a personal life example, right? And I just want you to just keep the thought in your head, and then I'll share my own view. Let's have a look at the can I test. I've got 10 activities on this list here. Each one of them is a decision that you could make as whether you wish to do it or not. The first thing I want you to do is to consider just the risk in the activity and say to yourself, is it within my personal risk appetite or not? Which you'll have a very strong appetite between your ears. Your brain is amazingly how good it knows it and applies it. And I want you to add up your number of yeses. How many yeses do you have down on that list? Just wait 20 seconds for you to think that through. You don't need to record it anywhere. Just think about it. I'm going to share mine. I've got 7 yeses, and they are the first 7. All right. I'm outside of Appetite on bungee jumping, skydiving, and base jumping. 8 and 9 used to be okay for me, but then I had children and my risk appetite dropped down to number 7. So I've got 7 yeses based on the level of risk that I'm willing to accept. Now, I then move across to should I. And for my first 7, which I said yes to, I now need to go to the third column, which is now assessing the level of reward that I expect to get for the risk that I'm taking. So I only look at the first 7 and I now go, is the reward worth it for the level of risk? Only when the reward is greater than the risk do I do it. Now, I want you to think about what yours would be, but I do want to share mine. Out of my first 7, the only ones I will do are the 5, 6, and 7. I don't believe it's worthwhile for reward to risk to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm sorry to be a stereotypical male, is number 1, lowest risk on the whole page. But reward, I see no reward in going to a shopping centre. It's negative reward for me. As a result, no way am I doing it for any level of risk. And the only other one I mentioned is standing within 1 metre of a roadside curb while waiting for the lights to change. Why would I do that? If I stand right on the curb, I will get across the road 3 seconds quicker. This then is my reward. The extra level of risk from standing on the curb rather than as far back from the road as I can, I'll let you decide. But for me, the risk way more outweighs the reward, so I'm not going to do it. 3 and 4 are for similar reasons. Now, out of all of that, I will then do 5, 6, and 7 out of all of those 10 based on risk-reward decision making. I hope that makes sense. Now, how do we practically apply this? There are a whole field of study on decision making, of course, but I want to share some really simple ones. The first one is like a scoring subjective judgment. And put very simply, on the right, we've got an assessment of the risks of a decision. And we've highlighted there that we've got a risk rating for that risk that we've highlighted. What's our risk appetite and whether we're within appetite or not. Now, the idea there is we're supposed to have all greens on the right side, and that is, yes, we are in appetite. If we've got any reds, we can't do it. In this example, we can't do it, so we would look to see if there's any ability for us to bring the risk down within appetite. If there is, we could maybe suggest, yes, we are willing to go and do this, but we would need to spend more. That would then impact the left side on the reward side. Right. Now we go now to the reward side. If we've got everything within appetite, and we now assess whether we've got adequate reward for the risk that's being taken. Ideally, we've then got all greens in the third column on the left and all greens on the third column on the right to justify it. Now, some of you may go, this is very judgmental, very qualitative. Yes, it is. But the clients we've had that use this, it's very important that it gets the conversation out on the table. And issues that may not be raised have been brought out, and therefore a rational, objective discussion can be made. For those of you that are more quantitative, you can start measuring the risks and the variation on rewards using such things as Monte Carlo simulation or decision trees. And this then goes and adds that semi-quantitative approach to doing this decision making. Michael.
I think all 3 of those that you showed there, which is in every decision, is they articulated some of the uncertainty around those decisions. And I think it's really important, and linking back to something you said earlier about asking people, do they know what the risk appetite is? But I think if you can refer back and go, well, we've accounted for uncertainty in this decision, and then we've made an assessment about whether we're happy with that level of uncertainty, however articulated, it's a sign that your risk appetite, however articulated or however cascaded down in the organization, is working, and it is helping your people make better decisions.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, is that that probability distribution shown by the Monte Carlo simulation, that range at the bottom is the uncertainty. And fundamentally, risk is the effect of uncertainty on. So thank you, Michael. Now, in terms of operationalizing through the business, we have a risk appetite statement at board level, and that's the one that sometimes collects dust and isn't communicated. It should be. How? There's no right answer. Here's some examples. The first one, it should influence your values and commitments as an organization. And those values and commitments need to be broadcast far and wide and frequently. And then we go all the way down to the coalface. How could we articulate the risk appetite and the boundary at the coalface? Things such as code of conduct, risk metrics, as Michael spoke about, cascaded down to the coalface, risk matrices that some of you may love or hate, minimum control standards for certain controls, policies and procedures, delegations of authorities. Now, what's really important here is that these are all aligned. It's not an easy job. So if the risk appetite statement changes, then we have to then make that change go through the organisation. The issue is that a risk appetite statement at board level will not be articulated in a manner that the people at the coalface can articulate. It therefore needs to be translated into their boundaries that they understand so that they can make decisions. Now, to sum that up, we should be inputting risk appetite into our strategic and business planning. People often say, what comes first, risk appetite or strategic plan? My answer is it's chicken and egg. They should go together. One is an iteration of the other, and therefore you should be doing your risk appetite refresh at the same time you do your strategic planning. It should be consistent with all your risk artifacts. Make sure they're not misaligned. Management and board reporting of the actual risk against performance should be done using risk appetite. Decision making should always use the can I test and the should I test, but can I use his risk appetite? And also make sure, as Michael said earlier, engage your stakeholders in the process.
David, this might be my favourite reminder in the book around outcome bias, that just because you've made a decision and it has a poor outcome, it doesn't mean that the decision itself was bad. And I go back to your definition of risk appetite and the freedom within boundaries. One of those was freedom to fail. So if you are accepting that there is uncertainty around your objectives, then you need to accept that sometimes there will be poor outcomes. As long as they're within risk appetite and they're expected that they will happen some of the time, we really need to be, I guess, embracing our people and saying, well, did you make the right decision? Not did you get the right outcome? Yes, I know there's always debate about whether, how often we can fail, but if it's not negligent, then I think we really need to be embracing our people and ensuring that they are given the right level of support when they do fail, to improve and continue to make good decisions that are about long-term sustainable achievement of objectives.
Yeah, it's so true. And as always, Michael, when you speak, my head kind of thinks about a few other things. And one of them is, I guess, a personal life share is that I love the principle and a mantra that I have is no regrets. No regrets. And what I mean by that is if something was to go wrong, I do the risk management exercise of root cause analysis and why did it go wrong? And if I go back and it comes back to a poor decision I made, I've got regrets. But if it goes back to I made a good decision, I did everything I should, I followed a good process, I thought about risk rewards, I thought about my risk appetite, and it still went wrong, c'est la vie. Yeah, it is what it is, and therefore it will be a decision that has gone wrong, but it was a perfectly good decision. You did it properly, and I think that illustrates it. So I'll sum this little remembering up by live a life of no regrets by making really good decisions, even though some decisions will go wrong. So let's move now to some summary tips for effective risk appetite management. Now, tips always come in tens. I don't know why, but anyway, we've got 10 of them. First one, make sure you set the right metrics, both for your objectives and your risks, your KPIs and your KRIs. Now, what is right? You've got to make that decision. Which metrics are the best ones that act as a great proxy against your measures of success and your risks? Don't overload the amount of metrics. Make risk appetite part of management. I even like to say make risk management part of management. And I often say my number one objective in life is to do myself out of a job. So risk appetite equally should be part of management, not just risk management. Ensure the trade-offs between risk and reward are clearly understood. We've covered that a lot. How does rebalancing that relationship do to the overarching risk to reward performance measure? Structuring reporting to get data to all levels of the organization. As Michael said, cascade it down through the business and get your metrics coming up from the bottom. So you've got buy-in at the bottom level at line one. Design risk appetite to encourage appropriate action. The so what question. Make sure it's designed that it can actually be used and it does influence behavior and actions. Articulate risk appetite in clear and understandable language so that our staff understand what it means. Don't use big words. I don't like big complex words. The English language is rich enough already. Keep it simple. And most importantly, use the language of your people. Know who you're talking to. Link risk appetite to strategy in your business plan. Nothing more to say on that. I think we've covered that a lot. Define accountability and action for risks outside of appetite. Escalation, reporting and response. Who is responsible? Review your risk appetite regularly. The standard is at a minimum annually, and more regularly if there is a prompt event. That could be the world changes. Haven't we seen that recently, where the level of risk goes up in the environment? We may need to change. We get better knowledge about a risk, so be willing to update it on a fairly regular basis. Maybe not daily, but certainly minimum annually, and maybe more often for a review. And finally, use the right software system to embed risk appetite data. This is the facilitator of making this all work and come to life, is to have a good system that embeds objectives, risk within the system, and allows you to operationalize your risk appetite statement.
Obviously, the caveat to go with that, David, is making sure that you're not overloading your people with lots of information. It can be easy to go overboard on collecting hundreds and hundreds of metrics that support, particular objectives or particular risks. So it's about understanding who you're reporting to, what information do they need, and what's the sort of, maybe not minimum information, but what's the right level of information that they need to make those informed decisions.
And I think the word that comes to me here in information, often less is more, but you just got to get the right information, the right metrics. Now, finally, one of the things we like to do at Protecht is to kind of bring it to life, because you can stay really conceptual with all this stuff, but bring it to life. And one of the things that I've been privileged for 26 years of Protecht to be doing is myself and Michael love thinking about risk management. We love researching. We love methodologies and concepts to be with it in an organization that puts it into practice. We have just around 450 clients that use and operationalize using our system. And therefore, we do see kind of warts and all and really practical feedback as to what works and what doesn't. And everything we talk about takes that feedback back to make sure it's practical. So for the final session, I just want to hand over to Michael just to give you a little bit of an insight into what it practically looks like, particularly from a reporting side. Michael.
So typically we find that there's 3 objectives to most risk reporting. I said 3, I'll come to the 4th one. So assurance. So are we managing risks within appetite or achieving objectives, sustainably achieving them? Red flags. Are we operating perhaps outside of appetite? Are there risks that we need to be paying attention to, take action on? And decision making. So the can I, should I test that David mentioned earlier. But when you really bring objectives into it as well, and you bring that risk and reward together, then you can get some risk-based performance reporting as well, where you are showing those 2 things together. And we think that is something that is really powerful. So this is an example of that, where on the left-hand side, we've got our key performance indicators. So this is our reward. And on the right, we've got our key risk indicators, which obviously is the risk side of the equation. This particular report is broken down by stakeholder. So we compare the risk and reward by stakeholder in this particular example. Here we've got a few greens on the left-hand side and some reds, all driven by metrics. So this has some quantitative backing. All that red on the red on the right-hand side would indicate that maybe we're taking too much risk in this occasion. So we might be getting some okay results, but it's the boom, 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 bust that David mentioned earlier. If we had switched those and everything on the left was red and everything on the right was green, then maybe we've got an instance of we're not taking enough risk, so we're not getting enough performance. The low, very low, 0, 0 that David mentioned earlier. This is one way of bringing that risk reward reporting together. So this is another example using the metrics, which can be KRIs, KPIs, depending on how you want to report or separate or combine those. But it gives you that trend over time of how you are either performing against your objectives, your key performance indicators, or those key risk indicators. So it's not just that point in time, but shows you ongoing as well. And here we've got an example of our strategic and operational themes and objectives. In this particular example, we've got a lot of these metrics, again, that show that trend over time and combines both the reward and the risk, and we're seeing it together here on the same page, as well as really diving into the key thing that does matter, which is the objectives and how on track we are to achieve those objectives. And finally, this is delving a little bit deeper into those objectives and KPIs. So again, taking that objective first approach and looking at the individual objectives, how well we're achieving them, and then backing that with some of those key metrics that support those SMART goals that David mentioned earlier. So it's really about bringing all of those things that we've covered today. So objectives, risks, how they align, setting those thresholds, tracking those thresholds, and bringing all of that data to the key stakeholders, whether it is the board, whether it is a risk committee, whether it is an individual objective owner, gives you all of the tools to be able to provide the right data to the right people at the right time.
Thank you, Michael. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. I just want to give you an insight for those that are interested in kind of what's coming next for Protecht. You may be interested. First of all, in terms of the strategy and objectives that we spoke about, in the middle, you can watch that webinar now, and you can have a look a little bit more detail of the focus on the relationship between risk and reward. And it all ties in, because in that webinar, if you didn't already see it, we do briefly touch upon appetite and mainly talk about strategy and objectives, but we've done it the other way around this time, but hopefully that makes sense. Also, if you would like to see more about our GRC system, Protecht ERM, then please contact us, go through our website, and we're more than happy to show you a more in-depth demonstration of it, give you more information to see what we love and live and breathe at Protecht. And over on the right side, there's some more resources that you might want to go to. Our website, we've got a knowledge centre, we've got ebooks, blogs, webinars, past webinars, and so on, because we do love, I guess, sharing knowledge with you guys and creating that relationship and community with you. So please do that. So what I'd like to do just finally is a quick comment from Michael, maybe a final comment to sum up the whole webinar. Because I put him on the spot, I'll just share mine. So he's got a couple of seconds to think about that. I think the main one for me is, do not let your risk appetite statement be a tick the box exercise. And I have definitely seen risk appetite statements that sit at board level. They never get operationalized. Why are they there? Because the organization has a regulatory requirement to have it. So, oh, there it is to show the regulator. And it is a complete and utter waste of time. The risk appetite statement at board level is the starting point. It's all about how it is operationalized and used through the organization and the extent it is used in decision making, and it influences people's behavior. Michael.
Maybe I should have gone first, because I think you kind of stolen it. For me, it's about embedding it in the front line. So your risk appetite statement is not just for the board or for the executive or for the risk manager. It should be something that helps your frontline people make improved decisions. Again, they don't have to read the whole risk appetite statement, but think about how it is going to be cascaded down to influence the behaviors on the front line.
Yeah. No, fantastic, Michael. And lastly, I just need to say a big thank you to Michael for supporting me, and thank you for everyone that took their time out of their busy day to listen. Obviously, you know where we are. We'd love to hear more from you. Also, if you would please stay online just for 1 or 2 minutes to give us feedback. Very valuable for us to be able to feed it back and improve the webinars in the future. And other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you might be. Thank you.